Hello, welcome to a slightly spooky Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Cidello.
This week, framework or house of cards? Democrats punt on major bills as Biden heads to Europe.
We're also going to look at the state election with national implications as Virginians go to the polls. But first...
On a day of high drama in Washington, D.C., President Joe Biden headed from the White House up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol building to cajole congressional Democrats into agreeing on a social spending bill after months of horse trading and hand-wringing. Behind closed doors, Biden reportedly told House Democrats the stakes couldn't be higher and that their majorities and his presidency will be determined by what happens in the next week. In front of the cameras, the president turned to the language of diplomacy. There's not a final deal, no agreement, but there is a framework.
Today, I'm pleased to announce that after months of tough and thoughtful negotiations, I know we have a historic economic framework.
Progressive Democrat hopes of a nation-changing social spending package to rival Roosevelt's New Deal of the 1930s or LBJ's Great Society of the 60s have run headlong into the reality of an evenly divided Senate and a deeply divided Democratic Party. Programs aimed at lifting the working class into the middle class, like paid family leave and free college tuition, have been thrown overboard to keep the bill afloat. Also missing from this framework, a plan to allow the government to negotiate prescription drug prices to make them more affordable. And a last-ditch billionaires tax proposal was also a no-go for moderate Joe Manchin. But with a price tag of around $1.75 trillion with a T, there is still plenty in there. For the environment, over $500 billion on clean energy tax credits, a tax on corporate tax buybacks, and a 15% minimum tax on corporate profits for big business. There's a formula for limiting childcare costs to 7% of income. For some folks, the child tax credit introduced this year is extended for another year, but not made effectively permanent as had been hoped. And there is a boost to Obamacare tax credits as well. But President Biden says this is how the democratic process is meant to work, and it is built on the ability to compromise.
We spent hours and hours and hours over months and months working on this. No one got everything they wanted, including me. But that's what compromise is. That's consensus. And that's what I ran on. I've long said compromise and consensus are the only way to get big things done in a democracy. Important things done for the country.
And you get the sense the erstwhile Senator Biden would have probably relished some more old-school deal-making, but he had a plane to catch, so it fell to Speaker Nancy Pelosi to continue to juggle competing priorities. Because while moderates like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema hold the whip hand in the Senate, it's House progressives that have the power to pull the plug on not only the social spending bill, but also that bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has still been tethered to it. There was an attempt to force a House vote on that second bill earlier today, but that suddenly evaporated. And Pelosi is doing a bit of a balancing act right now. She is urging her colleagues to focus on what they've achieved, not on the wish list items that have been torn up along the way.
It's pretty exciting. I'm so proud of the work that our chairs have done and the work that everybody did to try to cut it in half, and in a way that we could maintain support for it, because that is competition for the dollar, even at $3.5 trillion. When you cut it in half, it becomes, shall we say, keener.
Very keen indeed. I'm not sure if she meant to say she was proud of the way they cut it in half. Still, many of the House progressives are taking their cue from the independent senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, who, of course, you'll recall, former presidential rival of Joe Biden. He made prescription drug prices a key issue in his White House campaign, and he's still not quite letting that one go.
Frankly, it is simply not acceptable that uniquely in the entire world, the pharmaceutical industry here in America can raise prices to any level that they want, any time that they want.
Bernie says that has to be in the bill, but it's not in the framework. So what does Bernie do? Does he just give up on his pet issue? Has he got some kind of a wink and a nod with Joe Biden, a Plan B workaround? We we don't yet know. Either way, Nancy Pelosi is right. At $1.75 trillion, this is still a very big bill. It is historic, but arguably not big enough to be actually transformative. A lot of these measures are set to expire before they could have made a big difference. And if ordinary American lives aren't changed for the better, they might just look at that huge price tag and wince. This is the traditional business of Congress and the presidency, and it marks a certain return to normalcy. And for Biden and Sanders and Pelosi, this deal may well define their legacies, Chaz.
Look, there is no doubt, and this proposal, to be honest, is a long, long way from Bernie's dreams. It's also a long, long way from Democratic strategists' dreams. Drug price reform, Medicare expansion to cover ears, eyes and teeth. Those are some of the most popular proposals going around, full stop, and they're not in the package anymore. And the programs that are in the package, they've arguably been compromised to the point of dysfunction. Nevertheless, what optimistic progressives are hoping is that if voters get a taste of these programs, they might want to fund them at a higher, should I say, proper level. Progressive Ro Khanna, for instance, said, once we have these programs established, it becomes hard to take them away. So that's the gamble. Will it pay off, or will all these programs be washed away in 3 or 4 years? If the bill even happens.
Big if. Still, you're quite right. We'll know in the next few days. They had hoped to try and get this done ahead of next week's vote in the state of Virginia. State vote for their next governor, and it is looming as the most significant test of American democracy since last year's presidential ballot, of course, ended in a defeated president making baseless claims of fraud. In 2020, Democrat Joe Biden won Virginia by a 10-point margin, but a lot has changed in the 12 months since then. The first thing to know about the state of Virginia is that it is a Commonwealth, not a state. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania and Kentucky also do that. So do the US territories of Northern Mariana Island and Puerto Rico. So does Australia, for that matter. In the case of Virginia, though, it makes absolutely no difference. In everything but name, the Commonwealth of Virginia is a state. Once home to about 50,000 Native Americans, in the early 1600s, the English turned up and named the area after Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. One of the original 13 colonies, Virginia later became a hotbed of revolution. 4 of the first 5 presidents were from here, starting with Washington himself, giving Virginia the nickname the Mother of Presidents. Although it was reluctant to secede in 1861 as a southern slave-owning state, Virginia ultimately bore the brunt of fighting in the American Civil War, largely because the Confederate capital was established in Richmond, Virginia, and the Union capital, Washington, D.C., was just over the other side of the Potomac River. So Virginia's towns read like a roll call of bloody battles. Manassas, Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Appomattox. 500,000 men on both sides lost their lives here. Until the 1950s, Republican presidential candidates only won Virginia once, and for the next 50 years only lost it once. But Democrats have been winning here since Obama in 2008. But here's something. The election for governor of Virginia always falls a year after the presidential election. And for 40 years, from 1973, there was something of a backlash. The party in the White House lost the following year's governor's race in Virginia. That was until 2013. The streak was finally broken.
And CNN projects Terry McAuliffe has been elected, will be the next governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Terry McAuliffe is a longtime Democratic fundraiser, businessman and close buddy of the Clintons, as well as being a former chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Virginia law limits governors to a single 4-year term, but nothing stops you from coming back after a break, and that is what McAuliffe is trying to do, after briefly flirting with a presidential run in 2019.
He's focusing on civil justice, affordable housing, the economy, healthcare, voter restoration and prison reform.
Critics, though, say Terry McAuliffe's campaign is searching for purpose, focusing on everything and nothing. His opponent is this guy.
I'm Glenn Youngkin. As governor, I'll get to work for Hampton Roads. My day one game plan: create good-paying jobs for everyone.
Like McAuliffe, Glenn Youngkin also comes from a background in business and finance. He made a fortune in private equity, and he's been drawing on his reported $300 million net worth to self-finance his gubernatorial bid. and hammer McAuliffe's record using attacks from fellow Democrats.
We are dead last in America.
We're dead last.
Dead last.
I call for raising teacher pay above the national average for the first time in Virginia history. First time in Virginia history.
He had his chance, and he failed the people of Virginia. So why does he deserve a second chance?
This Virginia race is much closer than last year's presidential election. Polls in the last couple of weeks have shown Youngkin leading by 2, a dead heat, and McAuliffe up by just 1. The average of polls also has the Democrat just in front, but it is too close to call. And the election itself is being seen as a referendum on both President Joe Biden's job performance and former President Donald Trump's continued sway over the Republican Party. And you would be forgiven for thinking Terry McAuliffe was running against Trump.
Donald Trump, Donald Trump, 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 Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Trump, Donald Trump.
I'm glad I have 2 cups here so I can keep drinking when you mention Donald Trump's name.
Trump, Trump, Donald Trump, 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 Donald Trump.
And that was just in one interview. And a clearly panicked McAuliffe is wheeling out the big guns.
Virginia, you have a lot of responsibility this year. Not only are you choosing your next governor, but you're also making a statement about what direction we're headed in as a country.
Meanwhile, Glenn Youngkin is keeping his powder dry, winning Trump's endorsement, courting his voters while not mimicking his style and wisely keeping his distance from particularly Trumpy events like this Take Back Virginia rally.
She's carrying an American flag that was carried at the peaceful rally with Donald J. Trump on January 6th.
Hey, everybody. Can Republicans keep those Trump voters and win back the suburbanites who hated Donald Trump? Youngkin's polls suggest maybe they can. Virginia has seen plenty of historic battles over the years. This contest and what it might tell us about next year's midterms and even the prospect of a 2024 Trump comeback make it another fight with very high stakes for America.
Yeah, that polling you mentioned is surprisingly close from a state that Biden won by 10 points. But this explains why. As time has gone on, Virginia Republicans have become increasingly excited about voting, but Democrats, not so much. And as for independents, nationally speaking, Biden's approval amongst independents has dropped 27 points this year, from 61% to 34%. He's become almost as much of an anchor to Democrats as Trump is for Republicans. To translate to Virginia, in a recent CBS poll, 51% of Virginian likely voters said their feelings towards Trump were very motivating to their vote, whereas 48% of likely voters said their feelings towards Biden were very motivating. But it's not just about Biden. Terry McAuliffe isn't exactly the most charismatic politician in the world, shall we say, and he's left a trail of juicy sound bites out there for Republicans to exploit, like this one from 2009.
You know, listen, I'm also open if people want to talk about term limits. I just think sometimes too many people stay in politics too long, get in, make your mark, and go on and do something else. Let's continually bring new people into politics with lots of new ideas. It's good for the process. It'd be great for Virginia. It'd be great for our country.
Awkward! But more seriously, the issues have been moving the Republicans' way as well. For example, Republicans have been rabble-rousing against what they see as left-wing indoctrination in schools for 6 months now. They have felt that parents are being ignored. So imagine their delight when, as shown in this Glenn Youngkin attack ad, Terry McAuliffe dropped another one of those awkward sound bites of his.
The final debate between former Governor Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin. The topic was education, and Terry went on the attack against parents.
And I'm not going to let parents come into schools. I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach.
Terry failed Virginia's students for 4 years.
I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach.
Okay, so Republicans made a big deal out of that quote. But then, after that, a story broke where a schoolgirl allegedly had been sexually assaulted by a boy wearing a dress in a girl's bathroom. Bearing in mind, bathroom arrangements for transgender people have been a hot topic in American schools for the last few years. Anyway, the girl's father took up the story from there.
Basically, my daughter was sexually assaulted at the end of school in May of last year, and, I went to the school board meeting, to see what was going on. Another parent, activist, approached my wife and started antagonizing her, and I turned around and said stop, and then I tried to tell the lady what had happened to my daughter, and she looked me dead in the face and said, "That's not what happened." And that just struck me, like, how do you know what happened? You don't even know me. She threatened to ruin my business on social media. The next thing I know, I'm getting touched from all over the place. I didn't know who was touching me, who was grabbing me. I turn around, the police are grabbing me, and next thing I know, I'm tackled to the ground.
The father was then thrown out of the meeting, and the school superintendent denied at that meeting that any bathroom assaults had occurred in the school. An email later emerged, very much suggesting that the school superintendent knew that that was false. But the main reason that this story blew up was because this boy, rather than being arrested, was then transferred to another school within the district where he allegedly assaulted another girl earlier this month. Meanwhile, the first girl's dad pressed charges and the boy was found guilty this week. That's when the whole story really blew up, including the kids from the first school staging a walkout. You get the idea. Now, none of this is directly related to leftist propaganda being taught in schools. But nevertheless, schools and how much input parents should have into them have become the hot issue in this election. Since September, 10% more voters regard education and schools as one of the top two issues in the election, while 9% fewer voters regard COVID as being the two most important issues. And the result of that is Youngkin leading amongst parents of school kids by 17 points. And as far as Terry McAuliffe's awkward quote goes, 57% of independents in the most recent Suffolk poll believe parents should influence a school's curriculum more than the school board should. So it's hurting him. And of course, John, those suburban parents are exactly the demographic that the Democrats only just won from Republicans in the last few years. So the battle for that demographic has become trench warfare. It's the whole election.
Yep, the battle for the soccer mums and dads. For more, we're joined by the 68th Governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, former chairman of the National Republican Committee and two-time Republican presidential candidate, Jim Gilmore. Governor, welcome back to Planet America.
Thank you very much. A pleasure for me to talk to my friends in Australia once again.
So, Governor, some could look at a candidate doing well like Glenn Youngkin and say, hey, guess what? A less bombastic, less divisive, less controversial candidate than, say, I don't know, Donald Trump might be the key to winning back those white suburban voters. He could be the way of the future. Do you agree with that? Or is there something very specific to Virginia that doesn't carry elsewhere?
You're right. This is typically a Democratic now voting state, I'm sorry to say, but we know that Glenn Youngkin is a candidate who has a great deal of appeal, particularly in the suburbs in Virginia. And it looks like he will win. It's a very, very close election. It may turn on who turns out to the polls, but he's an appealing fellow. He's not threatening. He is not offensive in any way. And most importantly, I think that the issues and the big picture are coming to us.
Governor, is the closeness of polling in what is apparently a blue state a reflection on the quality of the candidates, or is it a reflection on where the Democrats are nationally at the moment, in your view?
In my view, it is both. No political situation is ever very simple. And in my view, the candidate is a good candidate. He's well financed. He's able to finance his own. He's also gotten substantial financial support. But what is really going on here is that the issues are coming to us. Locally, the education issue is now dominant. And that's because of the big picture nationally. The big picture nationally is the Democrats have been fostering a program that says that we're supposed to use critical race theory in our education. Mothers and fathers don't like that. They don't send their kids to the public schools to be indoctrinated, particularly on a liberal policy. They want their kids to go to school to be educated. But the direct answer to your question is that the national picture is making a difference. Joe Biden, President Biden, has grown increasingly unpopular in Virginia, just like everywhere else. He no longer is pulling the Democratic candidate for governor, Terry McAuliffe, in. He is now, if anything, dragging him down. And the result is that I think that the Republicans this year can win. I think that Glenn Youngkin can be elected governor.
And Governor, on the Trump factor here, everybody's talking about him, but he's kept away from this campaign. He dialed in to that one event. So what do you make of his presence, whether it is a push factor to get out Democrats, a pull factor for Republicans? What is the Trump effect now?
No, I don't think the Republicans are denouncing President Trump or being ugly or saying things about Donald Trump that are unpleasant. I just think that that the race is, and we want it to be, about Glenn Youngkin and about the Virginia issues. It is true the national issues are having an impact. There's no question about it. But I also believe that that what's going on is that the local issues are predominant at this point. So we're a national election. Virginia is only one of 2 states that are up this year. I think that the closeness of the race, and frankly, what I think is going to be the ultimate outcome, is in fact a reflection on President Biden and the left-wing policies of the Democratic Party. And
Governor Gilmore, what do you make of this apparent Virginia backlash effect, that a year after a presidential election, Virginia always seems to go for the other party, every time bar once in 50 years?
There may be a sense in Virginia that after they've had a chance to watch the other president of the other party for a year, that they turn around and decide they're going to elect their governor based upon what that governor is saying about what's going on nationally, or what that governor's candidate says he wants to do in Virginia. And the backdrop of that may have something to do with it because it's so coincidental. However, it's not universal. In fact, I believe that the Democratic candidate, it may have been Terry McAuliffe, was elected when Barack Obama was president. So it's not universal. So as a political figure and a person who's been in politics all my life, you can't count on that kind of that mystical sort of thing. You have to actually run the race. And you have to run the race upon what's going on in the background nationally in Virginia, because we're so close to Washington. In fact, we're right next to Washington. In fact, many of the people who live in Northern Virginia work in Washington in the administration. There's that backdrop. But most importantly, I think Virginians really look to their governor to say, how is the state going to be governed?
Now, in Virginia, no governor can run for re-election straight away. So do the benefits and detriments of incumbency apply to the ruling party at all? Or is it really like 2 new challengers for every election?
I think everything is like 2 challengers. It is true that you can't run one after the other. You can sit out and run again, and that's what Terry McAuliffe's trying to do. It's only been done once before, many years ago, in very unique circumstances where there was a realignment of the parties. But this is almost a new thing for Terry McAuliffe to come out and say, well, I'd like to have a second term. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Why would I think that? But I think that it is a unique situation. For some time now, with this Democratic governor, with these 2 Democratic United States senators, with the majority of the members of the House of Representatives being Democrats, with universal Democratic majorities in the state legislature, they're responsible for everything that's gone on, the disorder in the streets. I believe that they're attributing this chaos that went on in Afghanistan to the Democratic Party. We believe that the border chaos down there is being attributed to the Democratic Party. The local governor is not all that popular and is responsible for what's going on in Virginia. So I think that the Republicans are saying, hey, wait a minute, we see what happens when we lose everything. The time has come to be unified, and I think the Republican Party in Virginia today is unified.
Former Virginia Governor Jim Gilmore, good to have you with us. Thanks for your time.
Good, thank you for the opportunity.
Meanwhile, there is another state governor's race on next week, although it is garnering a great deal less attention.
Cross the river to the Jersey side.
Yes, let's call it New Spooky. A strongly Democratic state nationally that is not against electing the occasional Republican at state level. Think Chris Christie. Democratic Governor Phil Murphy looks pretty safe, though. His popularity has withstood the battering the state took from COVID and some pretty bitter debates in that state over lockdowns last year as well. He's leading Republican Jack Ciattarelli by 11 points, that according to the latest Monmouth poll. Those polls have tightened a little from a 13-point lead for Murphy in September and a 16-point margin back in August. Ciattarelli, he's an interesting Republican, though. He was the establishment's pick over some much Trumpier candidates. In fact, the 3-time former member of the State Assembly once called Trump a charlatan, and he does accept that Biden won the 2020 presidential election, which is rarer than you'd think in the Republican Party these days. But he did also speak at a Stop the Steal rally last November. He has not been endorsed by Donald Trump. And Democrats right now, fair to say, are a lot less worried about New Jersey than they are about Virginia. If Chitterelli loses, though, Trump backers will be saying, "I told you so." We'll see. Now, this week, the Vaccine Advisory Panel for the Food and Drug Administration gave the all-clear for the Pfizer COVID vaccine to be given to 5 to 11-year-olds. Data from the Centres for Disease Control showing that children in that age group are at least as likely to catch COVID as anyone else. Pfizer's head of vaccine research, Catherine Jansen, says that the 5 to under 12 cohort make up around 10% of weekly COVID cases in the US, and that immunising children will get America closer to herd immunity and with it the potential to stem the pandemic sooner. Sounds like a good plan. Meanwhile, a House subcommittee investigating the impact of the coronavirus pandemic has found that the virus took a higher toll on people working in America's meatpacking industry than had been previously revealed. They found that 59,000 meat workers caught COVID in just the first year of the pandemic, February, and at least 269 of those workers died of the disease. This report found that the employers failed to protect their workers, allowing the virus to spread in the close quarters of packing plants, and that workers were pushed to keep showing up at work even when they were known to be sick, Chaz.
And yet, 96% of those workers in some of these meatpacking plants are now vaccinated.
Yeah.
That's the power of a mandate. But back to the approval of vaccines for 5 to 11-year-olds. That is quite a game changer, potentially. The Pfizer trial showed over 90% effectiveness, with only 5 severe adverse events, none of which were linked to the vaccine. For example, one child swallowed a penny. I guess if you're going to test 5-year-olds, that kind of thing will happen. Look, we should also mention that the FDA announced this week that any of the vaccines can be used as mix and match booster doses for anyone who's eligible for a booster shot. Great news. But there was one article I found a little concerning, published by the New York Times. They found several advisors to the CDC and FDA who suggested that they believed the vast majority of vaccinated Americans were still protected and did not need booster shots. But they had felt compelled to vote for booster shots anyway. Quote, "These are not evidence-based recommendations," said one of the CDC's advisory committee. I don't want to hear this. Hasn't COVID been politicised enough? Even worse, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, came out with this humdinger this week. They said, this is in their official website, by the way, OSHA does not wish to have any appearance of discouraging workers from receiving COVID-19 vaccinations. As a result, OSHA will not require any employers to record worker side effects from COVID-19 vaccination at least through May 2022. So, to encourage vaccines, they're not going to record side effects? What? What are these people doing? If there are a lot of side effects from vaccines, then people should know that. John, this is exactly the kind of garbage that would gee up anti-vaxxers more than any list of side effects would.
This is a country where every pharmaceutical ad says side effects may include constipation and death.
Yes, I know, it's just... Anyway. So let's go back to numbers, shall we?
Yes.
I'm much more comfortable with numbers. Here is the rate of vaccinated people who have been hospitalised. Here is the rate of unvaccinated people who have been hospitalised, 18.5 times higher at the end of August. No politics there, just numbers. And one more vaccination fact. We hear a lot about how many people die from COVID, not so much about how many people live impaired from COVID. There was a recent study of COVID patients who registered at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Some had COVID symptoms, some did not, but nearly 1 in 4 of them had a problem storing new memories and general memory recall issues. Those cognitive problems were persistent in people who had gotten really sick and in people who had only had mild respiratory symptoms. 1 in 4 people. So maybe consider that when you're calculating your odds. Oh, I almost forgot. Cases, hospitalisations and deaths. all slightly down this week, but not really. They're not going anywhere. It's Groundhog Day. And as for the chart of Australian and American states combined, I entered the Northern Territory this week, so no more complaints. This is just the proportion of the total population that is fully vaccinated across the 57 states and territories of the two countries combined. The ACT is number 1. Woo! New South Wales is at number 7. Victoria is number 15. And you can see the rest there all the way down to the Northern Territory. Thanks for coming, guys. John.
Thank you, Chaz. Now, one of the most tantalising questions ever since that pro-Trump mob attacked the US Capitol building back on January 6 to try and stop the formalisation of Joe Biden's presidential election victory has been whether they had any inside help. There have been allegations that ringleaders were given special access, maybe maps of the Capitol, guided tours in the days beforehand from members of Congress or their staff. How else could they have found Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office? Surely they couldn't have followed the signs. The other burning question has been the extent to which the attack was orchestrated by the White House itself, and if so, how high up did it go? Well, this week, Rolling Stone magazine published what they called explosive allegations that multiple members of Congress were intimately involved in planning both Trump's efforts to overturn his election loss and the January 6 events that turned violent. Now, the bad news for Trump supporters is that several of the organisers of the rally held at the Ellipse before the mob stormed the Capitol are now talking to members of this House committee investigating the January 6 insurrection. The journalist who wrote this story, Hunter Walker, he penned this piece for the Rolling Stone magazine this week, says they have revealed extensive contacts with Republican lawmakers ahead of that attack.
So both of my sources said they participated in quote unquote dozens of briefings with Republican members of Congress and their staff. That included Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Paul Gosar, Mo Brooks, Madison Cawthorn, and Louis Gohmert. And we've already had some indications that these members were involved in the efforts to overturn the election. They spoke at the events at the Ellipse. They were billed as speakers at this wild protest.
So no great surprises there. Pretty much the usual suspects, really. The main sources for Walker's report remained anonymous, but they do implicate former White House officials, including Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, claiming that he had an opportunity to prevent the violence and did nothing. They also allege that Arizona Republican Paul Gosar gave the organisers of the events the green light with several assurances they would be given a blanket pardon whatever happened on the day, Chaz.
Yeah, now that pardon bit at the end is interesting, but as for the rest of the story, I suspect that look, there might be more coming. I should say it might be a series. But if this story is all we're going to hear about it, I suspect Hunter Walker might be a little over his skis here. He wrote that the Republican congressional reps were involved in planning both Trump's efforts to overturn his election loss and the January 6 events that turned violent. So what does that mean? Are we talking about planning the totally legal political rally beforehand or the actual storming of the Capitol, the violence? Walker leaves it suspiciously vague, although he does write, quote, multiple people associated with the March for Trump and Stop the Steal events communicated with members of Congress throughout this process. Well, those two are clearly legal protests. There's nothing wrong with that. A little too much imputation for mine, not enough actual evidence of wrongdoing. I mean, we already know that these Congress people were involved in the plan to protest Biden's election. Marjorie Taylor Greene put a video up about it on her Facebook.
Just finished with our meetings here at the White House this afternoon. We had a great planning session for our January 6th objection. We aren't going to let this election be stolen by Joe Biden and the Democrats.
But that's not illegal. So let's see what else Hunter Walker has coming. I do think, though, the Democrats need to be careful about overreach on this particular topic. In the latest Quinnipiac poll, when they asked, do you want to hear more information about what led to the events of January 6, only 40% of respondents said they do want to hear more about January 6, including only 40% of under 35s, 34% of black people, and only 33% of Hispanic people. And that's not because all these people are huge Trump fans. 59% of respondents considered January 6 to be an attack on the government. 57% believe Trump bears a lot or at least some responsibility for what happened. They're not MAGA heads, They're just not interested in hearing more about January 6. So I do think the Dems should watch out this commission doesn't become a fishing expedition, because I'm not sure that will help them in the long term.
Yeah, they're certainly still looking for a smoking gun, whether it's fake Capitol Hill credentials or a fire stair door being propped open. There has to be something that proves there was, dare I say it, collusion. Joe Biden has embarked on his second major overseas trip as president this weekend. America's second Catholic president will meet with Pope Francis at the Vatican. That coming ahead of the G20 Economic Summit in Rome. President Biden will also meet with his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron for the first time since relations were strained over the cancellation of Australia's submarine deal with the French in favour of a nuclear-powered model supported by the US and the UK under the newly inked AUKUS agreement. That deal, of course, was also viewed very dimly by the Chinese and, interestingly, President Xi will not be attending the G20 or, indeed, the subsequent COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. In what looks to some as a deliberate diplomatic snub is no biggie as far as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is concerned.
President Xi has chosen not to attend these summits. He's chosen not to leave China at all in calendar year 2021 to see any leader. That's, of course, his choice. So we are. Well, I'm not going to characterize the decision-making he's making. All I can say is from the U.S. president's perspective, President Biden does believe it's important that he have the opportunity to have a face-to-face engagement with Xi Jinping. And if it's not possible in person because of Xi's travel constraints, doing it by virtual meeting is the next best thing.
Travel constraints. So, face-to-face via Zoom sometime before the end of the year. Speaking of possible snubs, Russia's Vladimir Putin is another no-show next week, citing the surging COVID pandemic in Russia. Meanwhile, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was facing some awkward questions about why former President Barack Obama, Joe Biden's old boss, is going to the Glasgow summit, while Vice President Kamala Harris did not get offered a seat on Air Force One.
There is plenty of time for many prominent officials and prominent leaders to speak out about the climate crisis. As you know, it's not typical for presidents and vice presidents to travel together or to go to the same trips. So I think it's a reflection of that. And the vice president, of course, will be traveling to France soon as well on her own diplomatic trip.
She gets a trip of her own later. No snubs. So many snubs.
Travel arrangements again, John. Yes. Look, we're going to return to Glasgow in a second, but I just want to set the scene as far as climate change goes. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, reported that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, carbon emissions would have to be halved from 2017 levels by 2030, and then carbon neutrality would have to be achieved by 2050. Well, look how much the world's changed since then. Today, carbon dioxide concentration in the air has really not changed its climb one little bit. That is a straight line and an incredibly depressing graph. Please take it off right now. Thank you. Unsurprisingly, the world is not on target, with current policies putting us on pace for roughly 2.9 degrees of warming by 2100. Not good, although the projected range is somewhere between 2.1 degrees and 3.9 degrees. Meanwhile, coal consumption, that's the yellow line on that graph there, has risen in America for the first time in ages, and that's the relatively easy fossil fuel to move past. There are only 75,000 jobs connected to the coal sector in America, but there are 891,000 jobs connected to the oil and gas sector. In other words, the outlook for climate change reform is pretty bleak right now, but here comes sunny Glasgow, John.
Sunny Glasgow? Is there such a place? For more, Samantha Gross is with us. She's the Director of the Energy and Security and Climate Initiative at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Samantha, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks so much for having me.
So what would you say Joe Biden is hoping to come back from Glasgow with? What would be the best case scenario from his point of view?
You know, I think the best case scenario from Biden's standpoint is also the best case scenario from the planet's standpoint. He wants to see countries make firm and realistic commitments towards reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And he also wants to see increased funding for the developing world, countries that need the help from wealthy countries to make their own more ambitious pledges to reduce emissions, but also to adapt to a changing world. And so I think Biden's goals are entirely consistent with what many of us want.
Samantha, do you think it's looking like Biden's going to head to Glasgow with enough environmental legislation from the Senate for him to hold his own at the conference?
frankly, no. We have very polarized politics in the United States, and unfortunately, climate is caught up in that. And so there's just been a lot of back and forth because you need all 50 Democratic senators to go along with whatever happens in the infrastructure/climate bill. And so frankly, I think the rest of the world is concerned. They understand that we're polarized. They understand that we need congressional action for many of the things that we'd like to do to fulfill our pledge, and they're waiting. I don't think anyone doubts that President Biden is serious or that his team is deep and experienced. But at some point, we have to get the legislation in place, and we're just not there yet.
Given the nature of national domestic politics, in Joe Biden, it's all about trying to do some kind of a deal with a coal state senator like Joe Manchin. Do nation states having these kinds of summits even matter? We're seeing so much happening at the state and local level. That seems to be where the action is.
Yeah, absolutely. And during the past 4 years of the Trump administration, I often said in public and in various places that there was not a perfectly United States-shaped whole in climate action because of subnational actions, because of states and localities and businesses and individual people doing what they can. And in a federal system such as the United States, there are things that are really within state and local jurisdictions that matter a lot. Electricity systems, how transportation is set up in cities, things like that are local issues. And so local actions really do matter.
And what would you say were the positives and negatives to come out of the economic and social dislocation of the coronavirus pandemic? We stopped travelling, we stayed home more, we changed our patterns, and yet in some areas, carbon consumption and production went up.
No, I think we're still waiting for the verdict on a lot of things from COVID. The one that's really sticking in my mind is about travel. Business travel has not yet recovered. You and I are having this conversation over Zoom today. And I think many of us have realized, on the one hand, the real value of face-to-face transactions, and we understand when we need to be together. But I think we've also learned a lot about when perhaps we don't need to be together, and where this kind of interaction we're having now is useful. So I think it remains to be seen how much long-distance business travel will continue or come back, how much commuting patterns will change, how much people will decide they like working at home sometimes and spend less money and energy and time commuting. And so travel patterns are one thing that I really think they changed a lot during COVID. And I think the jury's out about what's going to happen to them going forward. We're all still finding our way in this new world.
What specific signs do you think we should be looking out for over the next few weeks in order to have some idea whether this conference is succeeding or failing?
I want to see countries talking not just about what commitments they're making, but about what policies they're going to put in place to achieve those commitments. Talk is cheap, frankly. It's easy to make a commitment and a lot harder to follow through. And so I want to see countries talking about policies that work and how they'll go back to their home capitals and implement them, and how they can work together to make those policies complementary rather than having a difficult time working together. The other thing that would mean success for me and that I'm really hoping to see is about financing, about the wealthy world helping the developing world to pay for the transition. You see emissions growing more rapidly in developing countries, even though they're starting at a much lower base. And those countries need our help to build up their energy systems in a green way, rather than in the polluting way that we all did.
Samantha, before we leave you, realistically, do you think the world is starting to recalibrate its goal to be 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, or is the 1.5 degree target still on?
You know, that is a fantastic question. And I think what I'm seeing here is some divergence between ambition and reality. You're seeing more and more talk about the 1.5 degree goal, particularly since an IPCC report came out recently, really showing the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees and what the effects look like. And so to be credible to many people in the climate world, we need to be talking about 1.5 degrees C. However, as we continue to move forward, we continue emitting, the concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere continues to rise. The door to get to a 1.5 degree C warming, to limit it to that level, is closing. And so I'm seeing this divergence of reality and practicality and the goal of 1.5 degrees C. And so if we're going to keep that door open to 1.5 degrees, we're going to have to really work on it.
Samantha Gross, thank you for being with us on Planet America.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, it's time before we go for a little fireside chat, and things are getting particularly scary right now, Chaz. For Democrats who are looking at these polling numbers for Joe Biden, the generic congressional polls, even worse for Democrats. Looks as though they could well lose that race in Virginia next week. They can't get a deal on Capitol Hill. Biden's gone to Europe. He's not going to get a deal on climate. It's all gone to hell in a handbasket, hasn't it?
Look, it's been a pretty bad last 3 months. Certainly after the Afghanistan, I wouldn't call it debacle, but it certainly wasn't a great moment for the Biden administration. The suggestion was, the numbers will bounce back after a couple of weeks. Will people forget about Afghanistan? Well, they have kind of forgotten about Afghanistan. And numbers, if anything, have gone down further.
Which is a worry, because clearly, it's not just the Kabul factor that is driving down these numbers. Biden hoped this was going to be an inflection point. He hoped that they were going to get this deal done before he jetted off to Europe and to help Terry McAuliffe out in Virginia. Instead, Democratic arguments of being able to govern, even though obviously they're herding cats. It's a 50-50 Senate. They've got a restive progressive flank in the House. This is hard stuff to do, but is he going to be able, I mean, he's right, isn't he, when he says that this could be the kind of most crucial week of his presidency and for Democratic hopes of holding on to Congress next year?
It's certainly the most crucial week for his legislative legacy, let's put it that way. I'm not sure it'll necessarily have a huge impact on the midterms in a year's time. Things change fast. But what I would say is that part of his problem is that even if I think they're going to pass a bill. I think they will. It won't be tomorrow, but I think they'll have a deal. But there's been so much ill will in this process, and so much at each other between moderates and progressives. I mean, it could be worse, but there's been so much of grudging sort of getting along that it means that they're not going to be acting like they won after the deal. It's still going to feel like a loss, even though it's a kind of a win.
Right. If you go from a $3.5 trillion to a $1.75 trillion bill, everybody has lost something. The question is right now, Bernie Sanders on paper looks as though he has given up more than, say, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. What does that mean next year as well when it comes to Democrats deciding, are we going to put forward a progressive candidate or a conservative candidate in a bunch of congressional districts? Because there are going to be a lot of primary battles next year where some of the ill will we've seen develop over the last few months could be playing out big time.
Look, yeah, I definitely think, I'm very careful to not be looking ahead to the midterms, because this happens every time. Every year, every election, every administration at this point in time, people start predicting the midterms, and they're usually wrong.
Well, except when they predict based on history, and they say the party in power in the White House tends to have a really bad first midterm.
Yeah, absolutely. That is true. That is definitely the case. But I would just say that you do get to a point after a while where there's just a sense of this administration is going nowhere. If 3 months turns into 4 months, turns into 5 months of just terrible poll numbers, Trump is, and some polls now, polling better than Biden is at the same point in time of their presidency.
Yeah, and yet, of course, then Trump...
And he was notorious for having bad polls.
Yeah, and then Trump failed to repeal and replace Obamacare. John McCain thumbs down, which is what Kyrsten Sinema could ultimately do in the next week as well. She loves John McCain. Yeah. She may well fancy that as well. Now, of course, the counter-narrative is Biden gets this deal done, infrastructure finally passes, that's got bipartisan support, the $1.75 trillion social spending bill, that passes. He can then spend all of the next 12 months telling people, hey, we just spent $5 trillion on you all, you should show a bit of gratitude.
Yeah, they spent $2.5 trillion earlier in the year and everyone forgot about it the week after. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to work as well as they think. What I would say, though, is the major issue for me is not about this bill or whatever. It's about the fact that the key parts of the Democrat constituency are deserting Biden at this point in time. He needs to find a way to deal with that. I don't think it's the bill. For instance, Hispanics. Like Hispanics now, Trump won a few extra Hispanics than people expected them to, but it's continued since then. Hispanics now, they're polling, he's lost 20 points amongst Hispanics in the last 4 months. On immigration, which is obviously an issue that's relevant to Hispanics, he's polling 23% approval on his handling of immigration. And this week, it's just gotten worse. Allow me to...
Please?
Because the numbers have just come out from last month. 192,000 encounters last month, which is That is way more than we used to see until this year. When you add up everything from this year combined, 1.7 million encounters during this fiscal year. That's the highest total of migrants apprehended ever on the border in history. And interestingly, the kind of migrant apprehended has changed as well. And this is a factor, I think, because usually they're from Mexico or from Central America.
Sure.
But if we remove the Mexicans, we remove the Central Americans from the numbers, have a look at these totals now. That graph we saw before, this is the same graph without those Mexicans and Central Americans. There's a flat line until this year, when all of a sudden there were 70,000 migrants last month that were not from Mexico or from Central America. They're coming from South America, they're coming from Africa, they're coming from Asia. It seems like a whole bunch of people have decided that this is the way to get in America now.
Which is bad news for the Biden administration, which is focusing on addressing the push factors from South and Central America.
Yeah.
It's clearly the pull factors of a resurgent American economy. People want to come to America to make some money they can't make back home, wherever that home is.
Which means unless Joe Biden seriously disappoints his base, he's not going to be able to stop it.
Don't worry. He'll find a way to scuttle the economy with inflation. No one will want to come there next year.
Well, tell these guys, this is a caravan that's coming right now. About 5,000 migrants make their way through Mexico. They don't care about inflation. They're a very well-organised caravan, I might add. They have a QR code to join up. And they're due to arrive at the border in about 2 weeks' time. And they're not taking no for an answer. Have a look at this. This is what happened when the Mexican police tried to stop them. Not much of a contest. It lasted about 5 seconds before they just broke through. So expect to be hearing a lot more about these guys over the next few weeks. But while we're talking immigration, I have some Rio Grande malarkey for you here, John.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
At Biden's town hall last week, he was asked whether he was going to visit the border and see for himself what's going on.
Do you have plans to visit the southern border?
I've been there before, and I haven't. I mean, I know it well. I guess I should go down, but the whole point of it is I haven't had a whole hell of a lot of time to get down.
Now, some have noted that Biden has had time to spend all or part of 108 of his first 276 days in office resting at one of his homes or at Camp David, whereas Trump spent all or part of 61 days at this point of his presidency at one of his relaxation properties and 9 days at Camp David, so that's 108 days of holidays of Biden, 70 days to Trump. Personally, I don't care about that because these guys are working at those places anyway, at least you hope they are. I want to focus in on the bit where Biden said he'd visited the border before and knew it well. Now, good old Pete Ducey questioned that, and Press Secretary Jen Psaki doubled down.
Why did President Biden say he has been to the border?
Well, Peter, as you may have seen, there's been reporting that he did drive through the border when he was on the campaign trail in 2008, and he is certainly familiar with the fact, and it stuck with him, with the fact that in El Paso, the border goes right through the center of town.
Okay, that El Paso stuff is kind of irrelevant padding, but what was that first part again?
There's been reporting that he did drive through the border when he was on the campaign trail in 2008.
Drove through the border in 2008. Is that what she said? Well, yes, she did. Journos recalled the visit where they landed at El Paso with Biden in 2008, and then they drove to some other place in New Mexico, and they were back in El Paso, flying off 5 hours later with no specific border-related stop. In fact, this here appears to be the drive that Biden took. So that 2 minutes you see there of driving was when Biden drove past the wall and visited the border and got to know it well.
You can learn a lot in 2 minutes on the border, Chaz.
Look, he doesn't have to visit the border if he doesn't want to. It doesn't matter. But spare us the malarkey.
To be fair to Joe Biden, though, when he started in politics, the Mexico border was in California. So he knows a lot about the border. That's it for another trip to Planet America. We'll see you back here at the same time next week or whenever you like on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube.
And for the Peppers, we'll have an all-new pet podcast coming your way as well later on tonight. I'm just going to take a break.
Bye-bye.
See ya.